She woke with a jolt under a pale blue sky, the kind that made her eyes squint even through the smoke left behind by the crash. Her small body ached from the impact. The metallic scent of burnt wires filled her nostrils as she crawled out of the broken pod. Her legs trembled while the wind howled like a warning. The silence of the strange planet pressed against her chest like an invisible weight. There was no sign of her crew. No sound except the distant rustling of wild trees. No color except the burnt silver of metal and the red soil around her. She moved slowly, limping, whispering her people's prayer for protection, but deep down she already knew the truth. She was alone. Then she saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, moving through the smoke, with something heavy slung over his back. A long object made of black material rested on his shoulder. His skin was not scales like hers. It looked soft but carried the roughness of survival. He walked like someone who had nowhere to be, and yet every place belonged to him. She tried to back away, but her leg gave out and she fell into the dirt. Her heart pounded. She had heard stories of this species, stories whispered in dark caves by frightened elders. They were hunters of the stars, unpredictable beasts with emotion in their eyes and fire in their bones. She had never seen one before. Most of her kind never did. But the tales had been passed down through generations. If one ever finds you, you run. If you cannot run, then hide. If you cannot hide, then pray your end is quick. He saw her. She held her breath and waited for the scream or the shot, or the strike. Instead, he crouched a few feet away and placed the black object on the ground. His eyes were calm, his hands open. He tilted his head like he was trying to understand what he was seeing. Her skin rippled with fear. She clicked her tongue in warning. A signal from her species, sharp and high. He did not respond with aggression. He reached into his pack and pulled out a soft white cloth, soaked it in a clear liquid from a metal flask, and held it toward her. She narrowed her eyes. Was it poison? Was it bait? What trick was this? But the cloth smelled of nothing harmful. Just clean water and something she could not name. Slowly he touched it to a scrape on her arm. She flinched and hissed. He pulled back immediately and raised both his hands again. He said something in his language. She did not understand the words, but the tone was gentle. Not command, not threat. She looked at him again, truly looked. His face had lines not from age but from worry. His eyes were tired. He did not smell like a predator. He smelled like earth and metal and old fire. She tried to crawl away again, but her leg dragged behind uselessly. He watched her struggle, then stood and walked in a wide circle around her, keeping his hands up. He went toward a small structure nearby. A ship, roughly patched together from different models and parts. A scavenger ship. Or maybe a wanderer's. She expected him to leave her behind. Maybe he would fly away and return with others. Maybe he would burn the crash site and erase the evidence of her arrival. But instead he came back holding something. A silver box. He placed it in front of her and opened the lid. Inside was food, not her food. Not anything from her world, but it smelled warm and cooked. Her stomach twisted in pain. Hunger had been rising like a wave inside her since she woke. She did not move. He took one of the food pieces and brought it to his own mouth. He chewed, swallowed, smiled. Then he pushed the box a little closer to her. She stared, her claws twitched. This had to be a trap. She had been trained for traps. Her people knew how to read signs. But this sign was blurry. Why was the enemy feeding her? Why had he not tied her down or dragged her away? She took a bite. The flavor was strange, heavy, spiced with something alien, but it was warm and real. And she had not tasted real food since the ration packs ran out 2 days before the crash. Her eyes watered, but she blinked the tears away. He watched her eat, then turned away and began to clean up pieces of the wrecked pod. Not destroying, not looting. Just moving parts around, sorting metal from wires. He worked with calm hands and a tired rhythm, like someone used to helping instead of harming. That night he made a fire. She stayed close to the pod, wrapping her thin arms around her body. He did not force her to sit with him. He just placed a blanket halfway between them and turned his back to give her space. The warmth from the fire reached her anyway. She wrapped herself in the fabric. It smelled of machine oil and dust, but also of safety. She did not sleep that night. She watched him breathe, watched his shoulders rise and fall, watched the stars above blink in the sky like distant memories. In her mind, the warnings echoed again and again. Humans are dangerous. Humans are monsters. Humans are the last thing you ever see. But in front of her, this one was snoring gently, with a half-finished sketch in his lap. A drawing of a flower she had never seen. She stared at the lines, the detail, the care. She could not understand. Why would a monster draw flowers? Why would a predator offer food? Why would he give her warmth and space and a blanket instead of chains? She did not understand it then, but something had already changed. Something quiet, something deep, and the stars above no longer felt so far away. The next morning she woke before the light fully touched the sky. The ground was still cold, and the scent of ashes clung to the air from the fire he had built the night before. She stayed still for a long time, listening to the soft rhythm of breathing from the other side of the camp. The human was curled near the remains of the fire, one arm folded under his head, the other resting across his chest. He looked so different from anything she had ever imagined. Her mind kept reaching back to the old stories, but none of them made sense now. This creature was not the wild beast she had been warned about. He did not roar, he did not tear, he did not stalk. He simply slept. She pulled the blanket closer and shifted slowly, testing her injured leg. The pain was still there, but duller than before. She managed to stand with effort, leaning against a bent piece of metal. The human stirred at the sound, but did not open his eyes. His trust puzzled her. Why would he turn his back to someone like her, a stranger, an alien, someone who by all rights should fear and hate him? The question stayed in her mind like a splinter. She moved toward the strange metal box where he kept the food. It was sealed tightly, but simple enough to open with light pressure. Inside were more warm portions wrapped in leaf-like fabric with soft edges. She took only a small piece and sat under the shadow of the ship. While she chewed slowly, she watched the human wake, stretch, yawn, and glance her way. He did not speak, only smiled and gave a small wave before walking to the edge of the camp where a group of small bird-like creatures were gathered. He crouched and scattered something from his pocket onto the ground. The creatures did not run, instead they moved closer with excitement, pecking at the seeds he had offered. He laughed softly, a sound that made her blink. It was not the sound of danger. He returned after a while with a bundle of wires and a small box of tools. He sat cross-legged near the campfire and began to sort the wires piece by piece, humming a slow tune with no words. She watched him with quiet fascination. His hands were rough but steady, his fingers long and careful. He moved with patience, taking his time like someone who had done this many times before. She inched closer bit by bit, pretending not to care, but every part of her mind was focused on him. She was not afraid anymore, just confused. He looked up once and tilted the small device toward her, as if inviting her to see. She hesitated, then took a slow step forward and sat across from him. He said something in his language again, then pointed at the device and then at her. She tilted her head, unsure. He placed one end of the device near her ear and then tapped his own mouth. She narrowed her eyes, then looked down at the box. With a few small twists, he connected a thin speaker to the side and tapped it again. This time when he spoke, she heard a soft translation in her own tongue, though broken and unclear. The words came slowly with strange pauses. Try speak now. Can you hear? Try speak now. Her eyes widened. It was not perfect, but it was a beginning. She answered hesitantly, choosing simple words from her language. The device crackled and responded in his language, but his face lit up with recognition. They both smiled, slightly unsure of what came next. Over the next few days they worked together, often in silence, but never in discomfort. She watched how he repaired broken pieces of tech using parts from old machines scattered around the camp. He shared stories through gestures and pictures, drawing scenes in the dirt or on scraps of paper. He showed her the sun paths of 3 nearby planets, the glowing rocks he had collected from a cave near the ridge, the broken transmitter he was still trying to fix. In return, she showed him a charm from her homeworld, a string of tiny bones wrapped in woven thread, a protection symbol from her people. He touched it gently with respect, not asking to keep it, but admiring it, as if it carried the weight of her world. One night a windstorm came without warning. The sky turned dark and the air thick with dust and static. He rushed to tie down supplies and dragged her inside. The ship where they stayed huddled in the narrow space between storage units. The walls shook with each blast, but he held steady. One hand gripping a metal beam, the other around her shoulder, keeping her from falling. Her heart pounded, but not from fear of him. It was the storm, the sound, the memory of the crash that rose inside her like a wave. She closed her eyes tight and clenched her fists. He leaned closer and whispered something she barely understood. The translator was weak in the storm, but the tone of his voice said everything. Calm, safe, wait, the storm will pass, and it did. The next morning when the dust had settled, he stepped outside, first checking for danger before motioning her to follow. The camp was a mess, equipment scattered, debris everywhere, but she saw something else too. He had built a new shelter for her, made of salvaged metal and fabric, shaped like the homes of her kind. A small thing, barely enough to sit inside, but it was familiar. It was comfort. She ran her fingers over the sides and blinked hard. He saw her reaction and smiled again. Not a grin or a smirk, but a quiet, soft smile that carried no pride, only hope. Later that day, as he sat by the fire sharpening a piece of broken metal into a tool, she found herself asking him something that had burned inside her since the beginning. Her voice shook, but she said the words anyway. Did you plan to eat me? He looked up, eyes wide, then shook his head and laughed, not a cruel laugh, but a gentle, honest one. No. Eat people? No, never, he said with effort and tapped his chest. Humans help, not eat. She stared at him, unsure whether to believe fully, but something inside her had already begun to shift. Maybe her people were wrong, maybe the stories were not true, maybe humans were something else. She did not trust him yet, not completely, but she no longer feared him. That was something new, that was the beginning of something neither of them could name yet. Something that had already taken root quietly, patiently, like a seed waiting for light. The sun rose slow and golden across the sky, while soft clouds drifted above the trees, and the camp shimmered with the quiet peace of morning. She sat on a rock near the fire pit, holding a round fruit he had given her the day before. Its skin was smooth and green with a scent she had never smelled before, something sweet and sharp at the same time. She turned it in her hands, watching him as he knelt near the edge of the clearing, working on a device with a broken panel. His back was to her, and his movements were steady and quiet. She thought again of how strange he was, not only in his shape or the sound of his voice, but in the way he moved through the world, as if nothing around him truly frightened him. Not the dark, not the loneliness, not even her. He had made no demands, never asked for anything from her, only offered food, shelter, and space. He spoke only when necessary, but when he did, his tone held a kind of warmth that made her feel safe, even when his words were broken through the translator. That day she walked toward him with slow steps, holding the fruit still untouched. He looked up as she approached and gave a small nod before setting the tool down beside him. She sat across from him, cross-legged in the dust, and placed the fruit between them. He tilted his head in question but said nothing. She looked down. At the ground, then back at him, and finally spoke. You are not like the stories, she said, with quiet voice. We were told you hunt. We were told you destroy. He leaned back slightly, arms resting on his knees, and waited for her to continue. We were hiding from another race, my family and I. The war came fast and loud. Ships fell from the sky like broken stars. We lost our world, our names. We lost everything. We ran to the edge of the system and hoped they would not follow, but they did. Her voice cracked, and she blinked fast, refusing to cry. Not here, not in front of him. He did not reach out, did not interrupt, only listened with the same quiet patience he always carried. Our pod broke apart during the last jump. I woke alone. I thought you found me because you were going to kill me, or use me, or take me back to them. Shook his head slowly, and his voice came soft through the device. I found you because you were alone. No one should be alone, not like that. Not after war. She looked at him with eyes that burned and a heart that felt too full. Why do you help? She asked softly. What do you gain? He smiled then, and picked up a thin metal piece from the ground, using it to draw lines in the dirt beside them. Slowly a shape formed, a wide-open hand holding a smaller one inside it. He tapped it once, then pointed to his chest. Long ago, he said, we did things wrong. We broke more than we built. I came here not to fight, not to fix, just to do better, one step at a time. She stared at the drawing, then at him again. You lost people too. His gaze lowered, and he nodded slowly. My crew gone long time ago. Ship damaged, could not leave, so I stayed. I helped where I could. Some come, some go, few stay. He pulled out a worn piece of cloth from his pocket and unwrapped it to reveal a small collection of flat stones, each one marked with a symbol or a name. He held it carefully like it was the most valuable thing in the galaxy. Each one someone I met, someone I helped or tried to. She reached out without thinking and touched one of the stones gently, her claws brushing over a mark that looked like a spiral. What happened to them? She asks. Some left, he said softly. Some died, some gave me hope. She did not speak for a while, just looked at the stones, and then at him again. He was not just a wanderer, he was a keeper of stories, a collector of moments, a protector of those who had no one else. Later that evening, they sat beside the fire again, the stars blinking above like tiny watching eyes, and she told him more of her life, her siblings, her planet, the taste of river fruit, the sound of wind through crystal trees, the laughter of her parents before the war. He listened and shared in return, telling her of oceans with waves taller than cities, storms that danced across desert skies, animals that sang during the moonrise, and music made by breath and strings and metal. He showed her an old recording from a broken device, a melody played by hands that moved fast and light across something with strings and wood. The sound filled the air around them, soft and sad and full of meaning, even without words. She closed her eyes and listened, and for the first time since her world fell apart, she felt something bloom inside her again. Not hope exactly, but something close. When she opened her eyes, he was watching her, and for a long moment they did not need words. At the days that followed, she began to help around the camp, learning the strange tools he used, copying his movements and asking questions through the translator. He never rushed her, always answered, even when he did not know the right word. They worked side by side like two parts of a larger thing, like survivors who had begun to understand that pain shared was pain lessened. She still had nightmares sometimes, waking with sharp breaths and trembling hands, but he never asked about them, only handed her a warm drink and sat close without speaking. And when he had bad nights of his own, when he stared at the stars for hours without blinking or moved through the day with shadows under his eyes, she stayed nearby, just within reach, letting him know he was not alone. They were not the same, not by blood, not by culture, not by history, but something had grown between them, something fragile yet strong, something real. And while the galaxy outside kept spinning, full of noise and war and silence, they had found something rare in the dust and quiet of that small forgotten planet. They had found each other, and that had already begun to change everything. The sun had barely begun to rise when the signal reached the edge of the camp, a distant echo from the stars. a soft pulse that lit up the human's old transmitter with a flicker of blue. He stood over it in silence, watching the weak light blink again and again, while the girl approached from behind, wiping sleep from her eyes and adjusting the worn cloth draped across her shoulders. She looked at the light, then at him, and for a long moment, neither spoke. They both knew what it meant. Someone was coming. Someone from beyond this place. Someone from her world. He touched a few buttons on the panel, checking the frequency, adjusting the settings until a soft voice emerged through the static. It was her language, fast and formal, crisp and clear like a blade drawn too quickly. A patrol had picked up the crash signature weeks ago and had finally narrowed the location to this planet. They were on their way now, hours at most, and expected survivors to prepare for extraction. Her breath caught in her throat. This was what she had wanted since the crash, since the day she woke broken and lost under a ruined sky. A way back home, a return to her people, to safety and order and familiar voices. But now that the moment had arrived, her chest felt tight and her thoughts refused to settle. Human stepped back from the transmitter, giving her space, letting her decide without pressure. She looked at him, then down at the dirt beneath her feet. The camp had become her world these past days. The smell of spice from his cooking, the soft scratch of his pen on paper, the sound of his footsteps during night patrols. All of it had become something she never expected to feel again, something like peace. When the ship arrived, it did not come gently. The roar of its engines shook the trees as it descended behind the ridge, kicking up clouds of red dust. A squad of armored scouts moved quickly into the clearing, weapons at their sides, visors shining cold and bright. She stepped forward, arms raised in greeting, speaking her identification with clear tone and calm voice. They scanned her body, checked her vitals, confirmed her identity. One of them leaned in close and asked in a low voice if she had been harmed. She glanced at the human who stood near the edge of the camp, still as stone, waiting. She shook her head slowly and said no. He helped me. He kept me alive. The soldiers turned toward him with caution in their movements. One of them raised a hand and spoke into a comm device, sending a message back to the ship. Protocol required detention of all unknown contacts for security review. Another stepped forward and gestured for the human to stand down and surrender his equipment. The girl moved between them without thinking, arms spread wide, voice louder than before. You cannot take him. He is not a threat. He saved me when no one else could. The soldier hesitated, not because of her words, but because of the way she stood, the fire in her voice, the certainty in her eyes. This was not someone lost or confused. This was someone who had made a choice. One of the officers pulled her aside, tried to reason with her, explained the danger of unknown contact, the risk of exposure, the importance of following regulation. But she had already made up her mind. She turned back toward the human and walked across the camp until she stood beside him. Her voice was calm but strong as she spoke. If he goes, I go. The words hung in the air like a spark waiting for fuel. The commander did not respond right away, choosing instead to observe the two of them, the dirt under their boots, the remains of shared meals, the handmade shelter in the corner of the camp. These were not signs of a prisoner and captor. These were signs of two beings who had survived together. After a long silence, the officer spoke into the comm again, this time softer. Orders were changed. The human would not be detained, but he must remain on the planet. No contact beyond this system, no transport, no record. She stepped closer to the commander, her voice steady. Then I stay too. There was confusion on the faces of the soldiers, surprise, hesitation, even doubt. One of them whispered that she must be tired, confused, emotionally compromised. But she stood firm. He gave me food when I had none. He shared shelter without asking for anything in return. He treated my wounds with hands that never shook, even once he listened. When no one else could, he taught me that not all humans are monsters. And I will not leave him behind. The commander finally gave a short nod. A choice had been made. The patrol would depart. She would remain. A beacon would be left in orbit should she ever change her mind. As the ship lifted into the sky, the roar faded, and the camp grew still again. She stood beside the human, watching the stars return above them. He looked at her with eyes full of quiet questions, but he did not ask why. She answered anyway. I thought going back would fix what was broken, but I was wrong. Home is not just a place. Sometimes home is a person. Sometimes it is a camp built from scrap and trust. He said nothing, only nodded once, and turned back toward the fire pit where the coals still glowed faint red. She followed him quietly, and together they rebuilt the part of the shelter the wind had broken the night before. Later, as the sky darkened and the stars grew bold again, she sat beside him with the old translator in her hand and began to record a message. Not for the patrol, not for her commanders, not even for the history logs. It was for others like her, and others like him. The message was simple. It began like this: I thought the human would eat me, but he fed me kindness instead. He gave me warmth and safety and asked for nothing but respect. He gave me a name again, and I will never forget that. As the stars drifted overhead and the fire burned low, the camp returned to silence. But it was no longer the silence of fear or isolation. It was the silence of understanding, of shared scars and quiet strength, and the beginning of something new. The nights had grown colder over the past cycle, and the wind moved differently across the valley, no longer wild but soft and thoughtful, as if the land itself had begun to understand the presence of the two who now called it home. The girl stood near the edge of the hill where the camp overlooked the wide basin of red earth and silver stone, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the stars blinked like scattered embers in the sky. The human sat behind her with a half-repaired device in his lap, soldering pieces together with steady hands and quiet breath. It had been many days since the patrol ship had left, and though no other signal had come, the camp had not fallen silent. It was alive in new ways, filled with quiet work, shared meals, old stories, and the sound of laughter that had taken time to learn. She had started to collect things from the area, stones shaped like her homeworld, flowers that glowed with soft light. When touched, bones of small creatures, which she strung together in patterns that held meaning only she could understand. He respected her silence when she worked, and she respected his when he watched the stars, drawing them in charcoal across rough canvas cloth. One morning she found him sitting beside the transmitter, again not to call for help, but to listen. There were still signals floating across the void, broken words from unknown sources, echoes of voices from other worlds. They had begun recording the clearest messages, storing them in a small device she carried around her neck. She told him once that voices should be saved like seeds because one day they might bloom into something useful, something brave. He had smiled at that and written it down in a notebook full of sentences she had said, things he found beautiful or wise or strange enough to keep forever. She teased him when he read them out loud, sometimes embarrassed by her own thoughts, but she could not hide the warmth it brought to her chest. One afternoon they walked beyond the ridge together, farther than they had gone before, following a trail of crystals that shimmered underfoot. They discovered a cavern hidden behind a waterfall where the walls pulsed with faint blue light. Inside were carvings from another species, perhaps, long gone, symbols that neither of them could read, but both understood in the way art sometimes needs no words. They sat together on the stone floor and drew in the dust their own symbols side by side, filling the walls with their own record of survival. Later that night, while the fire crackled and the wind danced through the broken trees, she asked him what he would do if a ship arrived tomorrow, offering him a way home. He looked into the fire for a long time before answering, "I do not know where home is anymore. Maybe I already found it." She nodded slowly and pressed her claws into the dirt beside her, drawing a small circle surrounded by tiny dots. "This means found. In my language," she said quietly, "it means you are no longer searching." Looked at the symbol and added another one beside it, a human shape holding a light. "That means keeping." She leaned back and watched the flames, thinking about everything that had brought them here: the crash, the fear, the silence, the choice, and finally the peace that had grown between them, without noise, without need, only presence. Their days followed a rhythm after that, working in the light, resting in the shade, cooking what they could find, building stronger walls around the shelter, not because they feared anything, but because it felt good to shape the world with their hands. She taught him words from her language, and he taught her how to play old songs on a stringed instrument he had made from scrap and wire. They played together, sometimes laughing when the sound turned strange or beautiful, or both. One evening, she sat down and began to record the story they had lived, not as a report, not as a warning, but as a memory for those who might come after. She spoke into the translator, softly letting the device capture every word. "I was afraid when I saw him. I thought he would hurt me. I thought he would eat me, like the old stories said. But his eyes were calm and his hands were steady, and he did not take." He gave. She paused then, and looked at him across the camp, watching as he sorted tools under fading light. "He gave me space when I needed it, and shelter when I could not stand. He gave me fire when I was cold, and silence when I needed to cry. He gave me time, and I gave him trust." He had moved closer now, sitting across from her, not speaking, only listening as she continued. "I do not know what comes next. I do not know if more ships will come, or if we will leave this place or stay forever. I know this: he is not a monster, and I am not alone, and that is enough." She stopped recording and placed the device in a small metal box along with one of his drawings and one of her carved stones, then buried it under the base of the old transmitter. Not for them, not for now, but for the future, for someone who might find it and need it. Days passed and the sky shifted as the season changed, bringing new winds and different stars. Their bond never needed to be explained. It had grown like roots, deep and quiet, holding them steady in a world that no longer felt empty. They sat together each night under the open sky, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, always present. The girl who once believed humans were monsters now believed something else entirely. She believed in the power of kindness, in the strength of choice, in the beauty of connection between those who should have feared each other. And the human who once thought he had nothing left had found a reason to stay, a reason to draw, a reason to build, and a reason to begin again. They were not the first to cross that line between species, and they would not be the last, but their story would last long after they were gone, whispered in quiet places, written in the stars, carved into stone, and it would always begin the same way. She thought the human would eat her, but what he gave her instead changed everything forever. The end.